Coming up in this episode.
On average, people were leaving more space when they overtook if I wasn't wearing a helmet. That study shows quite clearly that people's perceptions of transport behaviour and transport norms and so on are very much shaped by their environment. There has been a couple of papers published recently suggesting that people with e-bikes actually get more physical activity than people on regular bikes.
There's not the slightest doubt that bicycle riding, if persisted in, leads to weakness of mind, general lunacy, and homicidal mania.
Wow.
When the spirits are low, when the day appears dark, when work becomes monotonous, when hope seems hardly worth having, just mount a bicycle and go for a good spin down the road, without thought of anything but the ride you are taking. That was Sir Arthur Conan Doyle giving his testimony for cycling in 1895. He continues, "The bicycle craze seems to me to be only in its infancy, for probably in time we shall witness the spectacle of our businessmen going into their offices mounted on the bicycle instead of using the tramways." Conan Doyle was himself a very keen cyclist and even integrated cycling into one of Sherlock Holmes's adventures, The Case of the Solitary Cyclist. Now you could argue that in Conan Doyle's lifetime, cycling was one of the major forms of cheap and accessible transport, so necessity accounted for its popularity. But if you fast forward over 100 years, the bike is far from extinction. A UK government survey in 2023 showed that the average person in England spent about 6 minutes per week travelling by bicycle and made 2% of all of their trips by cycling. So what is it about these two-wheeled contraptions that appealed to us? What are the psychological barriers to cycling? And how do you go about encouraging people to hop on their bike instead of getting in the car? Welcome to Everything's Psychology, where this week we're talking about cycling. And I'm delighted to be joined by Professor Ian Walker from Swansea University, who really could not be better placed to talk about cycling and behaviour change. Ian is an environmental psychologist who has published many papers on the topic of cycling and on the psychology of transport. And personally, he's also the Guinness World Record holder for the fastest crossing of Europe on a bicycle. Hello, Ian.
Hello, Paul. Nice to meet you.
You too. So why is cycling a subject that a psychologist is interested in?
It's almost why isn't it? Because it's in some ways the perfect microcosm of human existence, and it's in some ways one of the best places to look at things that matter to us. So it's a place where we can look at questions like, how do you promote healthy behaviors? How do we encourage sustainable actions? And so if you're interested in areas of psychology like behavior change, it's a great place to do it. One of the reasons it's a great place to do it is not only because everyday active transport is known to be one of the best things we could do for population health and things like this, but it's also becomes very interesting because of what we know are the barriers to this. And the barriers are very often rooted in social psychology. The barriers are things like identity and social norms. It's not aspirational. It's in the same way that buying a big expensive car is. It's not something that most people do, as you just said. It's about 2% of trips. And it's not that far off 2% of people who do it. And so you've got all those things about social norms, identity, in groups, out groups. So in some ways, it's also an amazing test bed for looking at aspects of basic psychology theory.
All of that sounds, like almost you could just take cycling into the lecture hall of the psychology room and talk about it as a case study. And like you said there, the behaviour change and the decision-making process, I suppose, is a big part of what is your work and your research?
Absolutely. And in some ways, it's been quite a good time for me over the past 8 or 10 years, because there's been that wider understanding of the term behaviour change, or the idea, we used to talk about the same things under the term of public health or health behaviour, but it feels like some of these ideas have filtered into the wider policy world. Possibly off the back of nudge and those kind of behavioral economics things that got government very excited a few years ago when they thought they could fix everything without spending any money. But yeah, it's meant that people have been looking towards those of us who for many years have been working in either health behavior or transport behavior or sustainable behavior, and trying to learn lessons about how we can address meaningful real world activity through psychological mechanisms.
You mentioned nudge there as almost a catalyst, or at least a way of popularizing theory from psychology. What's your view on nudge when it comes to cycling and the effect or non-effect of it?
I have quite a few reservations about nudge. And I mean, you probably actually saw my face pull a little expression as I used the word a moment ago. I think there's a few things that give me pause for concern about that approach and other similar approaches. Probably the most fundamental is I feel it lacks a clear scientific basis, which is it's kind of impossible to know in advance whether any given intervention is going to work or not. So what we tend to do is we tend to do things, and if they work, we go, look at that, I nudged the behavior. And if it doesn't work, it never gets published and you don't hear about it. And I've actually got some very good examples on this computer here of classic nudgy behavior that didn't work. So if you're at a point where you've no idea in advance whether a certain action is going to have an outcome, it does feel to me like we don't have a very good understanding of the mechanisms that are going on there. So on the one hand, it feels a little bit hollow scientifically, or at least immature scientifically, which gives me a bit of concern about that approach. There's also another element, there's several elements, but one that I think is important, and I heard somebody else say this, so I'm sort of taking credit for their idea here, is why do we nudge some things and not others? And there's a moral dimension to this that maybe we don't address very well there as well. We don't nudge people not to murder each other. We don't nudge things that we care about. We sort of nudge things that we don't care about, at least at the policy level. And there's an element where I worry quite often that sometimes psychologists and other social scientists, we almost make ourselves slightly complicit in delaying action. So we organized a webinar on this a few years ago in the sustainability end, and we had various speakers like Stuart Capstick and people like that talking about these issues and really getting to, asking those questions like, well, do we researchers help people avoid making change to big social problems by saying, well, let's do another nudgy study, let's do another behavioral intervention. Yeah, well, let's spend 3 more years asking this. And with a lot of these questions, health, public health, sustainability, we kind of know what needs to be done. We just need to do it. And I do worry that often the researchers get, like me, I'm not saying I'm blameless in this, we kind of get sucked into doing more and more research, whilst all the time people who are benefiting from the status quo are very, very happy for us to carry on doing several more years of research.
Yeah. Is the alternative, though, to nudge regulation?
Yeah, absolutely. So in fact, literally yesterday, I had an email to say a really quite major new paper we've written has just been accepted for publication. And this was on transport. This is on the motor normativity work we've done about people's perspectives about transport systems. And that study shows quite clearly that people's perceptions of transport behavior and transport norms and so on are very much shaped by their environment. And a big part of that is the policy environment. Other elements are important as well, the social environment, the physical world, and so on. But the policy environment's a really important part of this. And we clearly picked up at least 2 separate relationships between how people perceive government policy and their perspectives on transport behavior. So those things are critical. And one of the things we recommended in that work is, if this is true, if people's actions are shaped by all of these multiple surrounding environments, your social environment and then the wider social norms, and going all the way out towards the big legal and cultural influences in our behavior. If that's true in that sort of social ecological model, well, it makes sense to start at the outside. If you can change that one big thing, like change a law or change a government policy, then that necessarily changes everything underneath it. The way I sort of joked about this a bit at an event last year, but none of us are getting any younger. I've only got so many more years to try and make a difference. And there's 8 billion people. I can't go and talk to them all individually and persuade them one at a time if I want to fix things. It's far better I speak to one politician and thereby influence a large number of people all at once through that politician changing a policy or changing a law.
Is there, though, a worry that you're removing choice? I mean, the whole, I guess, positive side of nudge was always that people still have the choice to ignore the nudge. And I can't remember exactly the phrase Cass Sunstein used. It was something paternalism, wasn't it?
It's either libertarian paternalism or paternalistic libertarianism. I can't remember
Yes.
which way around it goes. It's one or the other. Yeah, absolutely. But then I guess it also takes us back to the idea that we don't nudge things that we care about. We only leave people to make a decision where we don't really care what the outcome is. And with some of these things that we're talking, with some of the things, absolutely, by all means, people should be doing whatever the heck they want. I am quite a libertarian person at heart myself. But with things where we really, truly believe action needs to be taken, emitting toxic fumes that kill your neighbors and things like this, we probably do need to take action. And is that something we want to leave to individual choice? And I know it's sort of unfashionable in some respects to sound paternalistic and tell people what they should do, but it's a little bit like that Mike Tyson thing, everyone has a plan till they get punched in the mouth. And it's a little bit like that of everyone's a libertarian until something they care about comes along. And everybody has red lines where they will absolutely say, you should not do this thing. And so it becomes a question of when do you cross that line? And when are you comfortable with saying, yeah, just let people decide for themselves? And I think for me, the easy answer comes from your classic John Stuart Mill style libertarianism of, does your behavior harm other people? If not, do whatever you want. If it does harm other people, then we need to have a conversation about, can we do something to reconsider that behavior?
Yes. And as you're speaking, what comes to mind are sort of two examples, I suppose, where two different ways of changing behaviour happened. One was seatbelt wearing, cars in the 1970s or 60s, I can't remember when it came in, and the second is recycling. Now with seatbelt wearing, it had to be regulated because people were very resistant to that behaviour change. And there are still some wonderful, funny videos on YouTube you can look up of people being interviewed of why they won't wear seatbelts, and especially in the US. And so it was regulated. We had to. With recycling, though, it's not regulated. There's no law that you're breaking if you don't recycle. You choose not to. But over the last 10 years especially, the behaviour of people recycling has changed without regulation. So going back to your point of libertarianism, it feels like what's the difference between those two, and where does cycling sit?
Oh, gosh. You've picked a really interesting couple of examples there. And my immediate thought, and I might regret this if I was to think longer about it, but my immediate thought is it's almost like those two are the wrong way around. Now, I know the problem with what I'm about to say, but I'm going to say it anyway. To a first approximation, and yes, the paramedics, but to a first approximation, if I don't wear a seatbelt, it only harms me, which is certainly very different from if I do other irresponsible things in my car. If I drive fast, if I drive intoxicated, any of those things, they fundamentally harm others, whereas not putting a seatbelt on is much more fundamentally about myself. So there's probably an argument for saying that one is one where actually we probably shouldn't have needed to intervene. If people want to do really stupid things and put themselves in danger, is it the state's job? I don't know. but we could all have a view on that. Recycling, though, becomes a really interesting one. We don't mandate it, even though in a very small way, my failure to recycle does harm other people. But then, interestingly, we come back to the social psychology of this, because it's widely felt that one of the successes of recycling in this country, and here I am in Wales, I think it's about the highest recycling rates in the world. One of the successes of that has been curbside recycling. And there's almost certainly two basic mechanisms through which curbside recycling has been so successful. The social norm element, because you can see exactly what everybody else is doing, which of course is a really interesting thing that I can come back to in a second. And the behavioral control element, that ability of making the behavior easy, which, to be fair, does get a bit nudgy again. But because we said we were going to have a bit of a free-ranging chat, can I swerve wildly away from bicycles and talk about...
Swerve away for the moment, yeah.
Because that point, I've just reminded myself of some of the really interesting work I've been doing with colleagues back over at University of Surrey. So, like I say, curbside recycling, a lot of people have claimed that one of the reasons it's been so successful is the social norm element. You can see what your neighbours do. And in fact, literally, this morning, it was recycling morning. All the bags were out up and down my road. I could see exactly who had done it, and everybody had. One of the things that struck me a few years ago is, where is pretty much the only place where none of us know what's normal? So with most behaviours, we all kind of know what is the social norm, but there's one place where we have no idea whatsoever, and that is the bathroom. Because the bathroom is an intensely private place. And I had an opportunity quite a few years ago to start looking at what people do in the bathroom and to study the effects of these social norms. And then I met the colleagues at Surrey, and we carried on doing this. And in fact, we recently released some data from thousands of showers and how long people spend in the shower. And sure enough, over all of this work, the influence of social norms is incredibly clear. So people are sensitive to the norm, but typically they don't have it. And so I'll give you one example of how we tested that. So former PhD students of mine, Elaine Gallagher, we measured a load of people's showers for several weeks, and then we sent them emails with fake information about how average their showers were. So you get an email, and it would have an invented number in it. It would say something like, "Hey, Paul, thanks for letting us monitor your showers for the last few weeks. You are, on average, 3 minutes longer than most people, or 2 minutes shorter, or whatever." And what we found, as soon as people got that feedback, their showers immediately became more average. So if you told people they were above average, their showers immediately got shorter. And if you told them they were below average, their showers immediately got longer. So on the one hand, it's a really nice example of how you can be looking at basic ideas like social norms, descriptive norms in a real world setting, and use it to influence something like hot water consumption. And on the other hand, it's a nice illustration of how pervasive those effects are on a real world behavior like this. And that's one of the reasons we've become obsessed with bathrooms, because it's one of the few places you can look at human behavior in a real natural setting with this major influence stripped out.
How could that thinking be, or how has that thinking been brought into the world of cycling? And I suppose I haven't even defined cycling, because I know some people might be thinking cycling as an endurance performance sport. I suppose at the moment we're more talking about commuting cycling, choosing cycling over the car, in the mornings or what have you, but also recreational cycling as well.
Yeah.
But how is or should social norms be used? Because a moment ago you were talking about nudges, of which social norms is kind of in that ballpark. Can it be used effectively, like you were talking about the showers there, to change people's behaviour?
Yeah, and in fact, as you say that, it strikes me that both those elements that I was just talking about with the curbside recycling can be directly applied across. So the social norm is important. If more people cycle in an area, there's every reason to think that you'll get a snowball effect. Now, there's several things going on there. There's actually some nice evidence that drivers' mental models of the road change when they encounter more cyclists or pedestrians, which makes all of the cyclists and pedestrians safer. So you get a cognitive effect that means that more people cycling and walking makes all the cyclists and walkers safer, which means that more people cycle and walk. So you get these lovely iterative virtuous feedback loops through a cognitive process. But there's also that social norm process. So if more people do it, we're likely to get more people doing it. But there's also then the related element of that behavioral control. Is it possible? And this is one of the things that we've been doing quite a bit of work on recently, is the physical infrastructural barriers to more cycling or more walking. Fundamentally, we build our streets for the fast movement of motor vehicles, and everybody else is expected to work around that. And we've argued very strongly in this paper that we just had accepted, that should be out by the time this podcast is released. We in that study there, we contrasted explicitly people in Britain with people in the Netherlands,
Yes,
and also people in America. And it's clearly there. People in the Netherlands, where the infrastructure is different, have different perspectives and different behaviour. And so a key element of that's emerging from this is this idea, or this realization, that the behavioural control, the extent to which your physical environment enables you to do a thing, is really important. You mentioned earlier that only about 2% of trips are done by bike. A relatively small portion of people in Britain at the moment travel by bike, because fundamentally you're fighting the system to do it.
yeah.
You are not. It is not the path of least resistance. I can tell you for sure. The path of least resistance is get in your car and drive places. So we've got that really important element.
And just thinking about models of psychology as you're talking about that, you've got models like the theory of planned behaviour, and I'm even thinking of the technology acceptance model by Davis in the 80s. That the big part of that, and in fact I remember Davis writing about it, was the technology acceptance model looked at perceived ease of use and perceived usefulness in order to get somebody to adopt new technology. And at the time Davis was doing it, it was mainly about computers, what have you. But the way that you're talking there is the perceived ease of use. If the infrastructure is there, therefore it's easier for me to do, it's more likely to use it. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, and there is quite a bit of evidence for that. Now, it's not enough on its own. And there was a really good review published about a year or so ago on travel interventions, which said you can not only enable, you also have to drive change by making driving a bit harder. Because obviously people are in routines, people are in habitual states, which again is something that we've studied. If you just open new cycle infrastructure or new active travel infrastructure and say, there you go, by itself, why would somebody who drives every single day stop driving? You also need to address that side of things. But it's very much, the ability to do it, the infrastructure, the physical encouragement, it's very much there in that necessary but not sufficient area. You do need it. And there's another really interesting element, and this is actually something I keep talking about because it's a real illustration of where we psychologists almost need to speak to other people as well. So you mentioned theory of planned behavior. And so we're very much into that realm of arrows pointing towards the right where behavior sits. So there we go. There's behavior. And we say there's stuff that comes before it. And, if you take your theory of planned behavior or any of those kind of models, there's usually attitudes there as a precursor to the behavior. There's been some really interesting work from the human geography world in the past few years on what they're calling the reverse causality hypothesis. And what they've shown really nicely is that very, very often the attitude actually follows the behavior rather than the way we think it should be. So if your physical environment or your social environment or whatever makes a certain behavior easier, you tend to do it, and afterwards you tend to think it's a good idea, which is almost certainly a kind of cognitive dissonance effect. If you're being forced into doing something or encouraged to do something, you're not going to carry on doing it if you think it's a bad idea. So you're probably going to shift your attitude towards it. Now, I realize as I say this, I'm basically describing nudge again, which I was complaining about earlier.
My mind almost went back to more behaviorism and that side of it, that a behavior first attitude is to get people to start something and then change attitudes later, if needed at all, to be honest. Because once you've started to do it, then actually you can you start to introspect yourself. Why am I doing this? Start to feel good about it and do it more and what have you. So you've got sort of a good amount of that in there. And I remember BJ Fogg from Stanford University said that the number one worst way of changing behavior is to present information and hope it leads to attitude change and then behavior change.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've not made that link to behaviorism that you just mentioned. I think that's a really interesting idea. And it almost feels like those geographers I was talking about have sort of stumbled on this through different mechanisms. And it's another good illustration of why we all need to talk to each other a bit more. That last thing you said as well is absolutely correct. The idea that we can just give people information and expect their attitudes to change and therefore their behavior, it's not going to do it. I keep teasing people. I quite often speak to governments and third sector organizations, and I do sort of very slightly tease them by saying, it feels like people sit around going, look, if we can just come up with a really good poster, we're going to fix this. And there's this idea that if we can just get an amazing slogan, then people are just going to stop smoking. It'll be easy. Or, people will just suddenly all eat healthy diets. How hard can it be? And we forget the structural influences on behavior. We forget the massive role of habit in a lot of these things. And we also forget those things we talked about a few minutes ago, like identity and group cohesion and how behaviors are important in those. So we absolutely, if we want to tackle these big things like getting people to travel more healthily and cleanly, or we want people to have better diets or better physical health, we've got to be taking that more structural system of systems approach. We need more causal loop diagrams.
On that behaviour change aspect to it, I remember reading a paper that came out last year, I think, which explained cycling behaviour amongst their sample of it was in Brazil, I think, the Brazilian population, as being particularly sensitive to other people's influences, personal habit, and perceived behavioural control, and the belief in one's ability to change one's own behaviour. So when we're thinking about cycling, and if there was, somebody approached you and said, "Hey, Ian, we really agree with you that we would like more people to cycle, less people to bring their cars in to work every day as a commuting problem," how can you take the theories of psychology and then start to put a project together like that?
Well, I wish it were easy. I think those things you've listed are absolutely incredibly important. And there's even a slightly pithier version, which is the way people travel is whatever feels easy, normal, and safe. And if it feels easy, normal, and safe, then fundamentally people will do it. How do we do that? Well, this goes back, I think, in some ways to what we talked about a few minutes ago. I don't know if we're necessarily going to just fix this easily with a great message or empowering people or making them just feel like they want to. And I'll swing back to that in a second. It really does need that structural change. At the moment, in a world like ours, I could persuade you, I could give you incredible information that would persuade you that cycling to work is an incredible thing to do. And I can be very persuasive on that subject. But even if I completely convince you, if I then throw you out into a world full of hostile speeding vehicles and danger and pollution and fumes, it's not going to work very well, which is exactly why we're in the situation we're in. So we've obviously got the psychological element to this. We need people to want to do a thing, or it helps if people want to do a thing. But we also need an environment that enables people to do it. I said a minute ago, I was just going to circle back to that wanting to do it, because that actually nicely takes me on to another thing I've been working on for a long time, which is people's energy consumption, and in particular things like in-home smart meter displays. So I don't know if you have one of those.
Yes, we have one, yeah.
And one of the things that's interesting about them, and something we've looked at for quite a few years, is how incredibly badly designed they are. Because if you think of that simplest possible model of behavior change with two dimensions, so a dimension of motivation, if you want to do the thing, and then an orthogonal dimension of your ability to do the thing. What does that smart meter in your home do? Well, maybe it addresses your motivation. Maybe it says, oh my God, Paul, you're spending £50 a day on energy, which would be very, very motivating, would push you right up that motivation axis. But there is nothing on that smart meter to actually tell you what to do about it.
Yeah.
So it's incredibly badly designed from a psychology perspective, so it's the equivalent from a motivational behavior perspective. It's the equivalent of somebody running into the room and shouting, there's an emergency, and then just walking away again. Because yes, incredibly motivating, but you've told me nothing about what the problem is or what I need to do about it, which is why smart meter in-home displays have failed, I would argue. We did a study a few years ago where we tried doing it better. We created a prototype version that told you what was going on, but then told you what to do about it and why there was a problem. And we got people's gas bills down by 25% without them feeling any less comfortable.
Okay.
So it can be done by using psychology, but we fail over and over again. If you think of even that simplest possible behavior change model of motivation and ability to act, look how often we do just one of them. We motivate people. Maybe we put the price up of a behavior that we don't like. Yeah, I'm looking at the treasury as I say that. Or we do the amazing poster that tells people what a great idea it would be to do this thing. Or we tell them what action to take without telling them why to take the action, which is another classic mistake we make. We're very good at saying you should do this, but not saying why, not giving the motivational component. So every day we look around and we see what are almost basic textbook mistakes of behavior change because we're only ever addressing one bit at a time.
So thinking about those aspects, how could that be translated into the cycling world if your ambition is to encourage more people, I guess almost like the swing voters of cyclists especially, who may get up in the morning, they've got a bike, but they look out and go, should I, shouldn't I? How, from a motivational point of view or an ability point of view, how does one go about helping?
I really like that idea of the swing voters because you're absolutely right. What we might call the low-hanging fruit is massive. Loads of people have got a bike in their shed. Loads of people every day travel a short distance. So there's huge low-hanging fruit. And so the things we probably want to be doing are, first of all, doing potentially even quite simple things to make it more feasible, to make it safer, to make it more convenient to jump on a bike and cycle to work or cycle to the shops. Take a bit of space away from parking, slow down motoring in built-up areas where people live, create some infrastructure. We need to do those things. We need that big systemic policy level stuff because we can't just ask people to do it in a hostile environment. And then we need to get people to then want it, normalize it, make people realize that this is an option because there's that basic information availability element that people might even realize it's an option, and then let people find ways to do it. And if we can seed that, we get the social effects. The more you see people doing it, the more likely you are to want to do it. But fundamentally, and I hate saying this as a psychologist, I wish we could just do a psychology magic bullet, but in the absence of fixing the environment in which the behavior takes place, we're never going to get very far. We've had 80 years of just asking people to ride bikes on roads like we've got, and it has conspicuously not worked. Yeah. If we want to change the status quo, we can't just keep nudging. We can't just do an amazing poster. We've got to create an environment that enables the behavior. We can motivate as much as we want. If the behavior is not possible, it's not going to happen.
And I guess the environment of the behavior is more than just more cycle lanes, less dangerous vehicles on the road that you have to weave between. Does it include things such as employers having showers units at work, so therefore people feel that actually I can cycle but get refreshed again? Where am I going to lock my bike? There are all these things that go through people's minds, aren't there, when they're thinking about cycling to work, and actually can all be a barrier, as you mentioned at the beginning, the barriers to the behaviour.
Yeah, and there's possibly some nuances there that, there's a fair bit of evidence that what people think are going to be the barriers prove not to be the barriers if they'll just have a go. So shower is a good example, very often mentioned by people who've not tried cycling to work. You can get them to try it, very often they'll go, oh yeah, I don't need a shower. And of course, there's other ways around that. So one of the most amazing things that's been happening recently is the rise of e-bikes,
Yes.
which just completely removed the need to even think about having a shower. So there's other simple infrastructural things that can be done that would take away those barriers.
So you mentioned e-bikes, and I wasn't going to bring this up, but I'm quite interested because you're both a psychologist in this area, but also a cyclist yourself. And it sounds like you're somebody who wants to promote sustainable energy. Where does e-bikes sit amongst that?
They are amazing. They are the best. I literally will be going home on one in an hour or so. They're incredible. Yeah, they democratize cycling in many respects because they open up journeys to a vastly wider range of people. They, for the majority of car journeys, would directly translate onto an e-bike with no bother, because we know the majority of car journeys are one person traveling a very short distance by themselves. We know most people have the capability to do that. The energy consumption is preposterously low. The actual amount they use is trivial in the scheme of things. And yeah, they just enable this vast range of realistic journeys to be made.
Yeah, I bought an e-bike last summer. For the first time, I got rid of my old bike and got an e-bike because I'm getting older. I thought it'd be a helpful way and encourage me to go out even more. And I've yet to charge it.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and I'm amazed.
Well, and I don't know if you saw, but there has been a couple of papers published recently suggesting that people with e-bikes actually get more physical activity than people on regular bikes because it's so easy. You just jump on it without really thinking about it. You'll do more trips. And so the overall amount of physical activity and therefore the health benefits at a population level are actually greater.
It goes back to that perception again, isn't it? It's the perception before you do the behaviour, which often is the barrier.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really big factor. There's a really interesting anecdote about. No, sorry, cut that out. It wasn't going anywhere.
Go on, tell me anyway, and I'll cut it out.
It was so that because it's about that perceived. Okay, there's two, both on the same subject, because they're both about the things that people fear, but which turn out not to be particularly important. So one of them, the one that came to mind, and I realized actually maybe it doesn't fit perfectly, but there was when I believe it was the University of Western England were trying to encourage car sharing a few years ago. And they said, well, what we'll do, we'll have the best, most central car park only for people who car share as an incentive to do it. And somebody said, well, how do we enforce that? And they came up with a genius system that the car park barrier only went up if you pressed a button on both sides of the car at once.
Oh, yes, okay.
Which was a really neat system for heading that off. But I then thought of an even better example of a perceived fear that turns out to be something you just need to take away. So there's another workplace, I can't remember which one it was, where they were trying to encourage car sharing. And they found there wasn't much uptake. And when they spoke to people, they found that the big barrier was this fear of, well, what if the person who's brought me in can't take me home? What if that thing happens, they get called away and I'm stranded? And they just said, listen, don't worry. If that ever happens, you phone this number and a taxi will come immediately and you won't pay for it. And nobody ever called the number, but it unlocked the car sharing because it took away that fear of an unknown issue. So that sometimes you just got to unlock the behavior by taking away this thing that people worry about. Because if you can just get them over the threshold, and they
Yes.
try the new behavior once or twice, they realize that actually they were worried about something that doesn't really matter.
Yeah, and that reminds me, about a decade ago, I was working on a project with Sustrans, and we were just doing some qualitative research down in Cornwall, and people said, more than one, it came a pattern, that when they got up in the morning, it might have been sunny, but when they were coming home at 5 o'clock, they didn't know what the weather was going to be like, and they didn't really fancy coming home. They had things to do in the evening, or what have you, so they didn't want to get drenched. And so that stopped them. It was easier just to get in the car, and therefore the uncertainty disappeared. And we suggested, there's the idea that everything at that point was an app. So it was an app which just told them the weather now and the weather at 5 o'clock. And it's simple as that. So they just got rid of that fear and went, oh, okay, great, I'm going to be okay today. It never went ahead, but it does sort of embody that idea you were talking about with the cars.
Yeah, I love that. And I think that's a really good example. I'm trying to think, is there even a name for this? It's because it's almost like anticipated barriers, isn't it? It's almost like, people are not doing a thing because I guess it feels a little bit like simulation bias, that idea that things seem more likely when you can imagine them easily.
Yes,
So is it
and it's
somehow,
uncertainty as well, isn't it? And the fact that when
yeah,
you're not sure about something going your way, it's easier not to get in it at all involved.
absolutely, yes. And especially when it's normal to carry on as you are and it's your everyday habit to carry on the way you are. Absolutely. But yeah, it does feel like we need a name for this anticipated hurdles, and that maybe an element of behavior change is to know what those anticipated hurdles are and get them out of the way.
Yeah, yeah. Coming out of behaviour change a little bit, I'm interested also in attitudes and maybe almost identity. What role does self-identity take in people cycling?
Well, do you know, it's interesting you say that, because I always think one of the best ways to understand that is to jump to a subtly different group and think about motorcycling. Um, so if you said to somebody, because it adds a whole extra layer of identity that is possibly not actually there for cycling. If you said to somebody, listen, I think you should try motorcycling to work, then that to most people will feel like an enormous barrier. Obviously, you don't have the equipment, but that might be true of a bicycle as well. Obviously, there's the skill element, but there's a big identity element. I think to a lot of people, if you say you should be a motorcyclist, that feels like a group identity that acts as an enormous barrier. Now, it's probably stronger if you say motorcycling, because I think I know what most people are picturing when you say that word. But there's something of that also going on with cycling. Maybe not as extreme, but I think it's useful as a way to imagine what some people are thinking when you say cycling instead. And
Yeah,
that identity.
as a cyclist yourself, do you identify as a cyclist?
Well, it's interesting that some people very deliberately try to avoid that. And you see people who will explicitly describe themselves as a person on a bike or a bike user, as a way of trying to make the point that they don't want their identity to be linked to the way they get to work or the way they go to the shops. For me, yeah, I do kind of identify personally, because I've done a lot of different types of cycling. I do cycle to the shops, and I have on occasion cycled across continents. So I feel I've done so many elements of cycling. I think it is a part of my self-identity, but I don't think it needs to be. I think, and I always worry a little bit that the various versions of cycling, maybe in a sense, almost the fact that the sport element is so accessible to anyone that it's too easy for the sports side to creep in and colour the everyday activity. The sports side of driving a car is not accessible. You can't just go and become a Formula One driver. You can't just go and become a rally driver, but you can just go and race a bike at quite a high level. And so maybe it's almost that accessibility or the proximity of the sporting side of cycling creates that little bit of a barrier.
Yeah, and you alluded there to the more where recreational cycling moves up into competitive cycling. So, I know plenty of people who have joined a local group to start with, and they've entered the sort of local trials, then they've moved up to national, and actually, along the way, they're getting more involved, and they have a certain, they've joined a group where the dress code is, not explicitly shared, but they all tend to wear the same thing. And it just reminds me of this sort of, again, that self-identity side. And there was a wonderful paper published back in mid-2000s, I think, called Honestly, Why Are You Driving a BMW? And in that, it concluded that people derive the utility from having a very good self-image. And they do everything they can to try and maintain that self-image. And in that research, they found that for car buying choices, obviously from the title, their decision is swayed more by the status value of the vehicle than by its environmental credentials. Now, I'm interested in that with cycling because cycling has got this wholesome attitude that it is sustainable, it is healthy, it is active. But is there something in there which is less altruistic, that it's actually sometimes quite nice to buy something? Materialism kicks in. A bike costs 1,000 plus upwards. All of the kit goes with it. There are a certain type of people who like buying things. It makes them feel good. But also you get that self-identity once you've done that as you're somebody who's doing this in the group. And that then keeps that behaviour going.
Yeah, gosh, there's a lot there. I mean, one thing that's going through my head here is you just made me realise how much cyclists sort of get beaten about their clothing choices. Like, oh, you all wear the same. And nobody ever says that to swimmers or scuba divers, even though they all wear the same kit.
I think they probably would if a swimmer walked around the streets wearing Speedos.
But I think the analogy kind of holds up because why do scuba divers and swimmers all wear basically the same kit? Because it's really efficient way of getting the job done. And that's the only reason really that cyclists wear skin tight clothes, is because it's just vastly better for getting the job done. But yeah, the image stuff. I mean, again, sorry, I'm going to talk about some work we did. We did some work a few years ago with my colleague, Rebecca Hafner, who now works here at Swansea as well. And we published a paper called Image Not Environmentalism, where we were picking apart people's car purchasing decisions. Because there's some work quite a few years ago from the Department for Transport on climate change attitudes. One of the things that came out of that was their survey suggested that a lot of people buying a new car are worried about the environmental credentials of the car. And I did not believe that for a second. So this is an interesting illustration of where sometimes you have to go to qualitative research to really understand the subject. So in that survey where people had come along with a clipboard and said, listen, do you worry about the environment when you're buying a new car? And everybody goes, oh, yeah, of course I do. And then they get in their Range Rover and drive off. We probed into it in detail with people who'd bought new cars. And we deliberately did these very long interviews to keep them talking. And then what we did was, as you'd expect, we've kind of code every statement for what theme it's about, and obviously looked at how much people said about each theme. But we did this quite unusual thing of displaying on a graph the typical order in which the themes emerged in conversation. And this was an incredibly powerful graph because you've got the height of each bar, which kind of shows you how important each theme is. If they, do they say a lot about it or do they say very little about it? But then you've got the order of the bars on the graph, which is kind of how accessible the theme is to people or how willing they are to talk about it. And so one of the things that was interesting, as you'd imagine, money came up very early and people typically talked about it quite a lot. Image came up very late in the conversations. But when it did, people talked about it as much as they did about money. But it took them 30, 40, 50 minutes to get onto it.
Yeah.
And it's so hard for people to talk about, even though it clearly is incredibly important to them. So to swing this finally back to cycling, I think cycling in some ways is more complicated than that. I think there's obviously elements of that. There's obviously elements of image that matter to some people. And yes, you could spend a lot more than £1,000 on a nice bike if you want to. And yes, you can buy really nice clothing. But it's also, I think there's a really important distinction between the person who buys the flashy car and the person who buys the flashy bike, that the car is completely normative. Everything is pushing you to do that. Everything from the easy access to finance, the easy credit arrangements that have been put in place. The entire banking system is set up to get you in that flashy car. The streets are laid out for your benefit. The advertising industry is very much encouraging you to get in that flashy car. Everything is lined up, pushing you into that expensive prestige car. There is very little helping push you onto that prestige bicycle, even though they do exist. And so there's a really big element of outgrouping and social disapproval thrown on top, such that the person who's on the flashy bicycle really is swimming against the tide in a way the person in the flashy car is not. And I think that's a really important distinction that possibly pulls those normative and non-normative behaviours apart.
Yeah, and you've started to talk about the relationship between drivers almost and cyclists here. And we tend to view cycling as this wholesome activity, as I mentioned. But I found it interesting when I looked into it that the history of attitudes towards cycling is quite surprising. And there's this wonderful podcast called The Pessimist's Archive. And you can look it up. It's by Jason Pfeiffer. And in that, he pulls out some newspaper articles around the late 1800s, early 1900s about cycling. And I've got one here because it's mind-boggling. And the title of it is Lunacy in England. And it goes on to say, there's not the slightest doubt that bicycle riding, if persisted in, leads to weakness of mind, general lunacy, and homicidal mania. And it gets even crazier. It goes on to say, men who are apparently mild clergymen or placid physicians will, when mounted on a bicycle, run down other men and women without distinction and leave them dead or dying on the pavement without help to get the wounded or remove the bodies of the dead.
Wow.
Now, I think our attitudes towards cyclists have changed from that side of it too much, but there are attitudes, especially from drivers towards cyclists and maybe pelotons, people are going out recreational cycling and they're taking up, in the view of the drivers, a lot of room. Have you done any work, or is there any work on the sort of connection between drivers' attitudes towards cyclists and cyclists' attitudes towards drivers?
Well, there's definitely the former. There's a fair bit of work on how drivers view cyclists. I think there's a lot less on the reverse, which in some ways might be appropriate because there's also a massive asymmetry in terms of how much of the two groups harm each other or threaten each other. So it probably makes sense that the bulk of the research is on the people who impose the harm rather than the victims of the harm.
Yeah.
And I mean, there's a few interesting highlights I can skip over really quickly on what's going on in drivers' minds. One of the things that has come out from the work on drivers, and obviously, again, let's nuance this. Lots of people drive and cycle. Lots of people do both or neither. But I think we all know what we're talking about. One of the things that comes out very prominently is the idea that cycling is completely discretionary and actually quite childish in a lot of people's minds. It is seen as a pure leisure activity to a lot of people. If you are on the road, you are seen as getting in the way of people who are doing important adult business with your hobby and shouldn't be doing that. And so there's those fundamental misunderstandings. You also see that in terms of misunderstandings about money. So I remember maybe 20 years ago doing some focus groups with bus drivers. And I remember very clearly one of the bus drivers talking about the risk of being injured as a cyclist and saying, so why have you done that? You've saved yourself a couple of pounds on bus fare, but now you've been injured. And the only motive he could conceive of for riding a bicycle was to save money on a bus fare. And so you've got those fundamental misunderstandings as well. And this becomes really problematic if you've got people sharing a road, one of whom offers vastly more harm to the other than vice versa. And there's a fundamental misunderstanding about why that person is there on the road in the bicycle in the first place. This is not a recipe for happy coexistence and safety.
And that coexistence works the other way as well, doesn't it? Because there's pedestrians as well. And I'm interested, is the cyclist's attitude to pedestrians similar to a driver's attitude to a cyclist? And just as a personal anecdote, a couple of years ago, Jane and I went to Amsterdam. Now, if you've ever been to Amsterdam, it's very cycle friendly is one way of describing it. But actually what I found was there was an aggressive pack mentality to the cyclists towards pedestrians, to the point that we got shouted at quite a lot. And there was a junction which had a zebra crossing, and the red light was there. So all the cyclists, and we're talking over 100, completely crossed the zebra crossing and stopped, blocking any pedestrian from being able to cross the zebra crossing. And they weren't sorry. That it really felt aggressive. And I never felt that from cyclists before. And it just reminded me then that some of the accusations of drivers towards cyclists was being replicated in the cyclists towards pedestrians. Have you ever come across that? It's just an anecdote, not a research, obviously.
Well, I mean, it's a good example of how, like we said a couple of minutes ago, there's no such thing as cyclists and drivers. There's people in cars and people on bikes. And people are people, and people are often not very nice. And people in large numbers are often not very nice. And if you take a large number of people and give them, put them in a crowd where they are the majority, I think we all know from decades of social psychology how majorities treat minorities. It also, I think, takes us straight back to what I was saying right at the start of our conversation about the importance of infrastructure and the built environment, and the way that behaviour is shaped by the world around us. We should be designing streets so that different modes just do not need to coexist as much as possible. Yeah. If we design roads or streets, rather, in a way that requires negotiation and requires balance and requires people giving way to each other in a discretionary way and people having to share nicely with each other, this is never going to work because of those asymmetries. Even a person on a bicycle can be quite a risk to a person on foot. So why are we asking them to share space? Why are we asking them to have to negotiate and wiggle around each other and things like this? We need to be designing infrastructure in a way that accommodates those asymmetries, accommodates those imbalances, and doesn't require people to do inappropriate things. But I think that you can then actually make a very interesting political point here. Which of the groups in society are bundled together and left to work it out for themselves, and which are given exclusive ownership of public space? If you get in your car, you are given exclusive ownership of a big swathe of public space and no one's allowed to be in it. If you get on a bicycle or go on foot, you're often shuffled together onto a shared path and told to just get on with it and coexist. And so you get very interesting social, cultural power dynamics coming into play as well there.
Really interesting you say that, and I totally agree. I have observed an attitude coming from drivers, and drivers normally who aren't themselves cyclists, so therefore they don't have that side to them, that when cities now are implementing cycle lanes, often they're implementing it by taking away road space or overlaying road space. We have it in Oxford here, that the main road into Oxford actually is both a cycle lane and a car road, and it just has a cycle in the middle of the road, and there's no separate space for cyclists. And I've heard resentment almost from drivers going, I don't know what to do, who has priority, and actually why are they taking over the roads? Almost as you were saying a moment ago, I'm doing something important, whether it's commuting, delivering services, products, they're just cycling, or they're just treating the road as a gym.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a couple of really interesting things there. One is the language, and we published this work on motor normativity, the idea that we all have a weird cultural blind spot about this, and we all fail to judge these exact situations objectively because we're used to a world that is dominated by motoring. So again, look at the language that we just used there. It was taking space away. No, actually, historically, it's reclaiming space for cycling, which was pedestrian space in the first instance. Some of it became cycling space, and then motorists just dominated it. So interesting, the language of taking space away from motorists, even though they just overran it in the first place.
Yeah, I guess it's a classic loss aversion, though, isn't it?
Yeah,
it might be that they it's reclaiming really, but driver's had it. They've always had it for the last, for their lifetime, or drivers generally. They don't want to give it up now.
Yeah, and they're a majority. They're a normative majority as well, which is a big element of this.
So you've conducted a lot of research into cycling safety. And when I read this, I can't help but think about the Tulloch spike thought experiment, where Professor Gordon Tulloch gave that experiment in cars and said, actually, the safest driver would be one that had a steel spike that was always threatening your existence. And we've now got to a situation where cars are safer than ever. They're bigger than ever. They're boxier than ever. They've got side impact protection systems, and people who sit in them feel rather safe. However, cyclists should feel as very unsafe, because at the end of the day, they're just sort of fleshy sacks riding around these metal killers, really, potential killers. Is there an argument to say that cyclists would be safer if they felt more vulnerable?
No. I know where you're coming from, but fundamentally, the vast majority of people are not cycling, and the reason for that is that they feel vulnerable. We know there's really good data that it's the fear of those roads is what is stopping people above all else. Yes, weather and things like this, but the fear of traffic is the number one thing. Look how cycling shot up when there were no cars on the road in the pandemic. So we know that that's the big thing. So cyclists, to a first approximation, are already afraid. Thank you very much. And again, I think it comes back to that asymmetry. The person in the car, it would probably not be a bad thing if they were a bit more afraid, because the complacency is definitely a problem. But that's because they're the one bringing all the risk. We don't need cyclists to really feel more afraid. And I think you can actually even say, even on the shared use paths that we were talking about, even where you bundle cyclists and pedestrians together, and I'm going to go home on a shared use path shortly, even there, because you don't have the metal cage and the roll bars and the airbags and so on, it's a bit of it's almost like the difference between bees and wasps. The motorist can sting someone and there's no consequence for them. They can go on and do it again and do it again. At the very least, the cyclist is a bit more like the bee. If they do hurt someone, they're going to get hurt in the process. And so I don't know in that circumstance that they need to be more afraid.
No, but yeah, fair enough. And obviously I was only putting the question to sort of get the answer, really.
Sure.
When people go, oh my goodness, Paul's an anti-cyclist, isn't he? But you yourself have published papers on helmet wearing, for instance, and the effect that has both on the driver's behaviour, overtaking distance and what have you. Could you just briefly sort of go through that?
Yeah, I mean, that's been a long, murky bit of work that, as a piece of research that I thought would just be an interesting little experiment. It's led to an awful lot of controversy. So did some work quite a few years ago now, 20 odd years ago, where I went out on the road, cycled around in different outfits with and without a helmet, and found that on average, people were leaving more space when they overtook if I wasn't wearing a helmet. So on average, drivers were getting about 8.5 centimeters closer if I had a helmet on. And interestingly, a lot of people really didn't like that finding and have tried.
It's almost like
hard.
You're advocating getting rid of helmets.
Yeah, and again, I think that there's really important distinctions between that and, say, seatbelt wearing and things like that. But yeah, a lot of people didn't like it because partly I suspect a lot of people struggle. It's almost like a bit of a mental set issue or a mental model thing of, well, helmets make you safe. How can you say helmets might not be a panacea? Because I've been told helmets make you safe. And there's almost like that over-application of the mental model of safety. So I measured that, and there's been a lot of replications and follow-up work and that sort of thing. And then my colleague Tim Gamble and I did a thing a few years later where we just put people in the lab and we kind of tricked them into wearing bicycle helmets, because it just happened we had this eye tracker sitting around in the lab that had come with 2 head mounting systems, one of which was a baseball cap and one of which was a bicycle helmet. We said, great, well, let's get people into the lab. We'll randomly use one or the other of the cap and the helmet and put the eye tracker on them and see what they do when you give them a risk-taking experiment. So we got them doing risk-taking and gambling experiments with one or the other of these things on, which we told them was just a mount for the eye tracker. And we found more risk-taking when people had the helmet on, which again was sort of unexpected, but caused quite a bit of controversy. But it really feels like, I strongly suspect that's something to do with schemas again, or mental models of helmets invoke feelings or thoughts or whatever of safety and protection. And it does seem to have some effect. Now, again, there's huge asymmetries. There's a big asymmetry between what I do on a bicycle if I'm wearing a helmet or not, because I can control my own safety to some extent by being faster or more reckless and so on. But why that original research really mattered is it was suggesting that the other people who put me in danger might do so more or less depending on what I wear. And that matters more. It's that libertarian thing. It's one thing to put yourself in danger. It's another thing to put another person in danger without their consent. And if the way you're dressed or what you're wearing on your head makes a difference, then that's potentially important. But that comes on to something. And I'm going to find a way to tie this conversation together beautifully with a little bow on top. This work on motor normativity that we've done, this work on the blind spots we have about the safety of transport and the inevitability of cars crashing, and the fact that we even use the language of cars crashing, not drivers crashing, and all of this stuff where we normalize the harms of motoring. One of the things we've argued as part of this is we've been conditioned through decades of exposure, lifelong exposure, to see the harms of motoring as inevitable, as to be outside our control. And as a cyclist especially, look what you are offered as a solution to people putting you in danger with their cars. You are offered the option to put a hat on or to wear a jacket. And that's basically what you are told to do to protect yourself from a person in a 2-ton Range Rover. Does that not feel a lot like you're being asked to protect yourself from the weather? And we've argued that the way we are constructing it as a society is we view the harms of motoring, we view danger on the roads exactly the way we view the weather. Just a thing that happens. It's outside anybody's control. It's just always going to be there. If you don't like it, put a hat and a coat on, and that's all you can do about it. And we've argued that this is one of the prime barriers towards our addressing road safety, is that as a culture, we've constructed the consequences of human behavior as being outside human control in this one very narrow domain.
Yeah. It's almost like learned helplessness. The environment of the past, our experience of the past has made us helpless in this area. So we just shrug our shoulders and go, well, that's the way it is.
Absolutely. And it's very much something like that, because you see it all the time in any transport discussions. You can see it in the safety, well, there's nothing you can do. You just got to either stay at home or put a hat on if you don't feel safe. But we also see it in terms of demand management, that if you look at any transport planning, the assumption is that every journey is going to happen anyway. Every car trip is already happening anyway. So all we can do is funnel it down pipes and get it there as quickly as possible, as if they've never heard of induced demand or demand management or any of these things.
Yeah. How do we break that conditioning?
We need people to break out of this motor normative mindset. It's an unconscious bias. It's an unconscious bias like other prejudices that people carry. One of the things we've suggested is people probably need to start explicitly auditing their decisions as if they're not motoring decisions. So deliberately trying to abstract your decisions. So, for example, rather than say, who should get priority at a Pelican crossing, who should, maybe you reframe that as should healthy, clean travellers have priority over unhealthy, dangerous travellers. Just reframing things into more abstract, general terms to see if you still agree with what you're saying.
Yes, I see.
Because we have such a blind spot about it when it's in that one particular domain.
Yeah. And you started off our conversation talking about the importance of situational factors and the environment. I'm just going to sort of finish with that, really, because I think it's fair to say the motoring environment is changing quite a lot with electric vehicles now. So if the future fills our roads with sustainably powered self-driving cars, and I'm talking level 5, fully autonomous, so not in the next few years, but within the next 10, 15 years, then you've got the argument that maybe sustainably powered cars will have no environmental impact. Self-driving cars will be safer, so that danger you talked about will lessen, if not disappear. And obviously self-driving cars offer that greater protection from the elements, so that decision-making of should I cycle today is easier with an electric car. So if that perfect self-driving car of the future offers all of these sort of perceived usefulness, high perceived ease of use, what reason will there be to cycle anymore?
Well, it's a really good question. And there's a phrase I find myself shouting at the radio quite a lot, which is, what problem do you believe you're solving here? And I think it's a really useful thing to ask yourself when you think about that sort of future. We sat down, a PhD student and I once sat down with a piece of paper and literally wrote down the problems with today's relationship with motoring. And of our list of something like 15 or 20 problems, the future you've just described only touches about 2 or 3 of them. So this amazing self-driving car that's running off solar energy, it definitely would address carbon emissions, which would be great. Don't get me wrong, that would be a good thing. And it would certainly address safety if it's got a perfect robotic brain that never crashes into anything. So there's definitely some benefits. But then what about the other things? What about the social exclusion of people who can't afford this mobility? What about the social exclusion of people whose neighborhoods are separated by roads and they can't access their neighbors because it's unsafe and it's noisy and it's unpleasant outside because of motor traffic? Well, you've now just made more motor traffic. So that's got worse. What about, critically, the tens, hundreds of thousands of people dying prematurely because of lifestyle illnesses? That's just got worse because now nobody's walking or cycling anywhere. It's now, have you seen the film WALL-E? It's now
Yes.
That's what you've just created. A load of people completely physically inactive, sat in chairs, being transported from place to place by a robot. So they're all dying early of diabetes and Alzheimer's and things like this. Air pollution is potentially a lot worse suddenly because of the the tire dust and so on. There's so many problems that aren't touched just by fixing the motors and by fixing the driver. So don't get me wrong, those are not trivial. The carbon emissions, the collisions, they're incredibly important. And the collisions are almost certainly wildly more important than your listeners think, because it's about 1.3 million people killed every year by driving. But even those massive things are only part of the problem. Our current relationship with cars is so problematic. And to the extent I keep joking, tell me what you care about, and I'll tell you why less cars is the answer.
And you sort of answered my last question, which is, in 20 years' time, what is your perfect transport situation? Where are we heading? Where would you optimistically want us to be in 20 years regarding transport and cycling amongst that?
What I would love is not, ban cars or anything like that. I would love it if we all became mindful travelers. If what we did was, as we're leaving the house every time, we say, okay, where am I going today? What do I need to accomplish? What's the best option today out of this menu of options that I have available to me? Because the problem at the moment, fundamentally, the problem is, largely because of environmental reasons and social reasons, people default to the car for every single trip. No matter how long it is, no matter if they're on their own, no matter whether they're carrying equipment or not, they default to the car. We need people to be choosing from a broad menu of options, because if they do, and they chose sensibly from that list of options, they would rarely get in the car.
Ian, thank you so much. If people are interested in your work, your research, or even coming to Swansea and studying themselves, where should they go?
If you want to find me, then my website is drianwalker.com, where I tend to put things if I can manage it, although it did crash and I lost it all recently, so it's just reappeared from an old backup. Otherwise, of course, swansea.ac.uk for the university. And if anyone wants to come and study here, I would be very happy to talk about that.
And can they follow you on socials as well?
Yeah, I'm mostly on Blue Sky these days, ianwalker.bsky.social, and very active on there.
Great. Well, I hope they do. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope you enjoy your cycle home.
Thanks, Paul.